9. Charles de Garmo. Morality as Social Adjustment. Charles de Garmo, 1849 to 1934, president of Swarthmore and then professor of education at Cornell, was important in American education for his part in introducing Herbartian pedagogy to the United States. Its overpowering influence over American teachers and students in the 90s has been likened to a tidal wave by educational historians. C.C. Van Loo, Charles McMurray, and Frank McMurray were among those also important in the Herbartian movement in the United States, whose major influence was between 1889 and 1901. Subsequently, the National Herbartian Society changed its name to the National Society for the Scientific Study of Education, and men like G. Stanley Hall and John Dewey developed new concepts in education, often in Herbartian categories of thought. Johann Friedrich Herbart, 1776 to 1841, a successor, 1809 to Kant's chair of philosophy at the University of Königsberg, made a major impact on Western education, particularly in Germany and the United States. Basic to his educational philosophy was the insistence that education be moral in outlook, morality, however, being not primarily religious in nature but social. A matter of adjustment of the individual to society, this was not the negative concept it was later to become. For Herbart, it meant more in terms of the ideals of his day. The term virtue expresses the whole purpose of education. Virtue is the idea of inner freedom, which has developed into an abiding actuality in an individual. His fundamental postulate in approaching this concept was the plasticity or educability of the pupil, but unlimited plasticity was an inadmissible concept. The first and foremost idea in Herbart's was thus moral education in this non-religious and educational sense. The second idea was apperception, or the mental assimilative powers of the child, as the means to this education, involving the important doctrine of interest as basic to education. The 5 ethical ideals in Herbartian thought reflect Kant. 1. The law-giving will, or inner freedom, an idea related to Kant's dictum, "So act that through your own will the maxims of your conduct might become universal laws." 2. The idea of perfection or efficiency of will in terms of this inner freedom, that is, the coincidence of volition with judgment. 3. The idea of benevolence, sympathy or goodwill, unselfishness. 4. The idea of rights, thus defined by Herbart. Rights, legal, is the concordance of several wills regarded as a rule for the prevention of strife. The idea of rights is thus legal rather than supernatural or natural rights. 5. The idea of justice or equity. While the ideas of inner freedom and of perfection are merely formal, the ideas of benevolence, of rights, and of justice are substantial. The 3 universal virtues are these: love, right, and justice. These are, let it be noted, substantial and not objective virtues. For Herbart, while religious law is very significant for the germination and growth of moral character, yet he who does right only from a consideration of God and the future life is still very remote from true morality. The regard for religion is based on the fact that, with occasional exceptions, the way to morality passes only through legality. It is immediately apparent that Herbart's morality is Kantian and well on the way to existentialism and pragmatic relativism. As the religious coloration of the times began to wane, the purely social aspect of Herbartian educational theory grew more vocal. The Herbartian psychology furthered this socialization of man. One of the best definitions of Herbartian apperception came from Carl Lang. Apperception is therefore that psychical activity by which individual perceptions, ideas, or idea complexes are brought into relation to our previous intellectual and emotional life, assimilated with it, and thus raised to greater clearness, activity, and significance. At first glance, it would appear that this concept is in disagreement with the Enlightenment's concept of the passivity of the mind and its malleable character. This is definitely not so. As Garmo pointed out, the Herbartian psychology rejects as pure myth the idea that there is, in the human mind, any independent or transcendental faculty whose function is to will, and which is free in the sense that it can originate actions that are independent of all ideas or of thought processes. On the contrary, with Herbart's system, volition is strictly dependent upon ideas, a product of them either as they originally appeared in the mind, or as they have come to be thought, repeated returns to consciousness. It is in terms of this essentially passive concept of the mind that Herbartians deny the transfer of training or the efficacy of the doctrine of mental discipline, the formal culture of the mind. Because of this passivity, Garmo could say with Herbart, "Children have at first no real moral character." Herbart, long before Freud, whom he influenced greatly, introduced the doctrine of man's determination by the unconscious into educational thought. For Herbart, the overwhelming aspect of man's mind was the unconscious, in contrast to which the range of consciousness and the threshold of consciousness are relatively small. Even the content of the conscious mind is guided by the ever-active contents of the unconscious. The culture epoch, or recapitulation concept, was also basic to Herbart's thinking. Thus, man's mind is not only governed by racial history and the unconscious, but must be conformed to society to be moral. It is not surprising that Herbartian thinking, instead of creating the free man of many-sided interests desired by Herbart, led to a socialized man. Indeed, the goal was, in Garmo's words, a socialized individual in an individualized society. Thus, Garmo found himself in agreement with E.A. Ross, who, in Sin and Society, distinguished between the old and new concepts of sin and vice. 1. Old. Sin is violation of the laws of God. Crime is violation of the laws of man. 2. New. Sin is conduct that injured others. Vice is conduct that injures self. In terms of this anthropocentric view, Garmo did not believe that justice required retribution in terms of God's righteousness and the protection of society, but that justice should concern itself more with the reformation of the criminal than with God's law and man's society. Accordingly, all things must be read in terms of a society without God, and that society must dedicate itself to the adjustment of its members. Not only must education be adjusted in ends and means to the society in which we live, but it must also be adjusted to the individual to be educated. In this education, interest is essential. A more adequate conception of the group of psychical states known as impulse, desire, interest, volition is that the self is seeking through its own activity to express or realize itself. We may say, in general, that interest is a feeling that accompanies the idea of self-expression. Man's salvation depends on interest, which enables him to discover his deepest self. Not only interest, but play was important to Garmo. To him, athletics and athletic training represented the new asceticism of his day. Art, however, had central importance. Garmo was an early and able champion of the functional concept of beauty. As he stated it, there is an actual, possibly a necessary correlation between mechanical efficiency and aesthetic proportion. In other words, as a tool or a mechanic increased in all-round efficiency, there is a corresponding increase in the aesthetic quality of its proportions. For Garmo, after Schiller, art is the bridge we must cross in going from animality to rationality. The elimination of religion, thus, is complete, and the excision of any absolute law from ethics a radical one. It is aesthetic expression, a purely personal activity and a subjective response which makes man truly human. It is not character, intelligence, godliness, or scientific inventiveness. Man's morality, moreover, is social adjustment. The results of such education have not been, however, new achievements culturally and advances ethically, but the rise of the holy barbarians, men who have invested their ancient lusts and violence with a modern sanctity.